Okay, we're recording. I am Brandon Polite, professor of philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by James Shelley, who is Lloyd and Sandra Nix professor of philosophy at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama. He's also, as of 3 days ago, prior to this recording, beginning his 2-year term as president of the American Society for Aesthetics. James, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Brandon. Thanks for inviting me.
Awesome. So we're going to talk about the nature of aesthetic value. And this is something you've written a lot about and spent a lot of time thinking about. And you have this really terrific paper from 2023 in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism called A Simple Theory of Aesthetic Value. And exemplary of its title, it's a 2-page article. And it's absolutely delightful. And recently, you've expanded on this 2-page article to develop a more worked out theory that will be forthcoming in a special issue of Philosophical Topics, edited by Dom Lopez. And so I think the place to start is to just situate the audience, right, with respect to what are some of the main theories of aesthetic value that have been developed historically. And so a big one historically is hedonism. Another one, maybe more recently, is experientialism. And so I think maybe the place to start is just, can you give an overview of what hedonism is?
Sure. Like the simplest form of hedonism is just a thing's aesthetic value, its beauty is just the value it has in virtue of giving some pleasure. So why is a beautiful thing valuable? Well, it's valuable because it gives pleasure. That's a simple statement.
Yeah, right. And so in some way or other, beauty or positive aesthetic experience, right, the value of positive aesthetic value is grounded in pleasure, and presumably then negative aesthetic value, right, ugliness, disgust, is grounded in displeasure or something along those lines.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so what are some of the main reasons that proponents of that view give to support it?
So I think that proponents of hedonists have traditionally not given any reasons in support of hedonism, because it has always seemed just so obviously true to everybody that it hasn't needed any kind of support. We'll get to experientialism in a minute. I mean, that's an offshoot. But I think that so people have worried about hedonism, and so that's why experientialism came on the scene. But I think those two theories in general are not argued for. I would say they're developed, and they're mainly developed. So let's just start with the simple view that aesthetic value is value a thing has because it pleases. And then if we run into problems, then we'll add some bells and whistles. But we won't argue. We won't argue for the claim. Well, here's an argument. I think this is an argument that hedonists is committed to, although I don't think it's an argument that hedonists articulate. But here's a premise: things that have aesthetic value give pleasure. Here's another premise: pleasure is good, pleasure is valuable. We can draw a conclusion. We can say, well, if that's true, then things that have aesthetic value have the value of giving pleasure. And then it seems just a very small step from that claim, the claim that things that have aesthetic value have the value of giving pleasure, to the claim things having aesthetic value have the aesthetic value of getting pleasure.
Yeah.
So I'll just say that the argument presumes that once you get extensional adequacy, if it's the case that everything that has aesthetic value has the value of giving pleasure, you're home free.
Yeah, right. And so, as you said, proponents of the view typically haven't really given arguments in support of it. It just has to do with cashing out the precise nature of, the pleasure that beauty gives, right? And so for Kant, it's like the free play of imagination and the understanding. That's where the pleasure resides. And so, yeah, it's just this very simple idea that aesthetic value resides in the ability to give pleasure. And again, it's, beauty is this higher level pleasure. There may be, lower level type pleasures that like come from, the sensations we have of things. But yeah, positive aesthetic value then is grounded in, or at least in some way connected to pleasure. And so what do you find wrong with that view?
Yeah. Can I just say, first of all, that there's a long history, obviously, of connecting beauty and pleasure. It goes back to antiquity. This is controversial. I mean, not everyone's going to agree with this, but I mean, in some of my work, I have done some historical work, and I tend to think that the presumption that hedonism must be true is fairly new. So, for example, you're exactly right to say that Kant defines beauty in terms of the pleasure it gives. But on my own reading of Kant, I don't think he's a hedonist. I think that he's a hedonist with respect to the agreeable, and the difference between the agreeable and the beautiful is precisely that the beautiful's not like that. So anyway, I want to claim that Kant's thinking more the way that I am. But I think that shortly thereafter, like as soon as you get to Schopenhauer, I think Schopenhauer is a hedonist, and then from then on, it's just sort of seemed obvious to us. And there's a specific reason why he is. But I'll get away from this historical stuff. That wasn't your question. The question again was,
what's wrong with hedonism?
So let me, since we're going to talk about experientialism in a minute, I won't say anything that's wrong about hedonism that's also wrong with experientialism. So I think that the reason many would-be hedonists have fled hedonism and become experientialists is that they think that hedonism is not extensionally adequate. In other words, they think that there are aesthetically valuable things that don't give pleasure. And you could call this the problem of aesthetic pain. So certain works of art, for 20th century works of art seem to be the best cases, but going back to antiquity, tragedies, it seems strange to say you would go to see Oedipus the King in order to take pleasure in his gouged out eyes and then the understanding that he comes to have of the world and his place in it. And so we wouldn't want to say, but we want to say this is an aesthetically good work, and so we want to make. So anyway, we want to make. So it just seems false to say that everything that has aesthetic value gives pleasure. And so it can't be generally true that a thing's aesthetic value consists in the value of the pleasure that it gives.
Yeah, right. And so, historically people have attempted to, reconceive pleasure such that painful things, like tragedies, like horror, like disgusting things, right? There's some sort of like perverse pleasure or pleasure star that's a particular kind of aesthetic pleasure that we get from, watching the suffering of Oedipus or him gouging his eyes out, or
yes,
the villain in a slasher film cutting up the teenagers by the lake.
Yes, right. So if you've decided that hedonism is true, then you have to give these kinds of what seem to me contorted explanations, very, very complicated explanations, like introduce various epicycles into the theory to try to figure out how you can make it the case that these things that on the face of it don't seem to be designed to give pleasure, they seem maybe designed to do the opposite, how it's nevertheless true that they do give pleasure.
Yeah.
One way is, I think this is, I actually like Kendall Walton's view. This is a 1993 paper, How Marvelous, I forget the rest of the title. But it's a view according to which we take pleasure in the object's capacity to get us to experience pain. So we admire it it sets out to give us a painful experience. We admire it for its capacity to do this well. That admiration is pleasurable.
Yeah.
I would say if I were a hedonist, I would be attracted to that view. But,
yeah. I mean, that is the most plausible, I think, of like the attempts to make the view work, because there is something like aesthetic delight in the disgusting, or in the tragic, in the horrific, right?
Yeah.
That, people do enjoy it.
Yeah. I mean, for reasons we might get to, if I were to, I tend to like hedonism better than experientialism, actually. So although I'm making this objection on behalf of the experientialist, I'm not moved by it myself. So I agree with what you just said. There are lots of things that you can say here. And I think you're giving up something important when you give up hedonism and move to experientialism. That seems to me a clearer move than the experientialist realizes.
Okay, so let's get into experientialism then, right? So it's an offshoot of hedonism in some sense. So what precisely is that view?
Well, I mean, I think probably we should think of hedonism as a species of experientialism.
Oh,
so
gotcha.
if you're a hedonist, you're an experientialist.
Yes.
But you can be a broader experientialist than just being a hedonist. And what you do is say, the experiences that aesthetically valuable things give are valuable for lots of reasons. One of them is sometimes they give pleasure, but in other cases, they give a different kind of valuable experience, not a pleasurable one. So what we'll do is we'll just say, given that there are lots of different kinds of aesthetic objects that provoke lots of different kinds of reactions in us, lots of different kinds of experiences, we'll just say that the aesthetic value of an object consists in the valuable experience it gives rise to. And we'll leave it open what that valuable experience is.
Yeah. And so people who maintain this view are like Tina Wynn, I think, right?
I take him to be an experience. Yeah, I take him to be an experiential. I think he's got a very attractive, as experientialist views go, his is very attractive.
Yeah. Right. And so the aesthetic value resides in the valuable experiences we get from engaging with objects of a particular sort.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, good. So the argument for that view, right, I think it comes from recognizing the limitation of hedonism, right? That not all aesthetic objects, or at least, not all, anything not everything in the realm of the aesthetic appears to be pleasure giving, right? There's
right.
displeasure that we might not want to contort into a form of like aestheticized pleasure star, right? And so, recognizing the limitations of hedonism, right? We sort of broaden it out to, well, no, the aesthetic experience, or rather aesthetic value, resides in a particular form of experience. And then it becomes cashing out like the nature of aesthetic experience versus other types of experience.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So what do you feel are the limitations of the experientialist view?
Well, so one reason that I'm fonder of hedonism is that, like, hedonism is an explanation of value that aesthetically valuable things have. So once you tell me, look, this thing gives pleasure and pleasure is good, I now know what the value is. But if you say this thing gives an experience, and that experience is a good one, but experiences, look, pleasure is good, but experiences aren't good. Some of them are good, some of them aren't good. So once you move from pleasure to experience, you've now given up an explanation of value that you had as a hedonist, and you now don't have one. Some experientialists go on to try to give one. And then some of them will say, look, there are lots of different ways we can go here. It could be valuable. It could be cognitively valuable. It could be that we learn something from the experience. It might be valuable in some other way. But I'm surprised how often experientialists don't realize what they gave up in making the move from hedonism to experientialism. You had an explanation of value. Now you don't have one. You've got to give one. And what you can't do, I think, is just say, well, somehow it's valuable. That's just giving up on explaining value.
Yeah,
So,
right.
so
Go ahead. Sorry.
oh no, I bet, but then there are concerns that I have about both of them that I can go into if
Yeah,
you're ready.
please.
Okay, so
Go into it.
so I think that there are two things that experientialists, whether they're hedonists or experientialists in some more broad way, struggle to explain. And one is that a thing's aesthetic value is rooted in the way the thing is. So if you take an aesthetically valuable thing and even make small alterations to it, you're going to get now a thing with a different aesthetic value. I don't make the claim that two objects couldn't have the same aesthetic value, but if two objects could have the same aesthetic value, they'd have to be aesthetically the same, right? But what couldn't happen is that two things have the same value, same aesthetic value, and they are very different. That would not be possible. But when you're talking about the value of pleasure, for example, that seems to be the clearest case we have of the value of an experience. It seems like that value can separate itself off from the object. So something else that doesn't have its character, and you might even go as far as say a drug, might give you the same pleasure. And if it gave you the same pleasure, it would have the same value, but it couldn't. Because aesthetic value is not that kind of thing.
Yeah, right. I think
so. That's the separability objection, and it applies to hedonist versions, strict hedonist versions of experientialism, but I think it applies more broadly to any version of experientialism.
Yeah, right. I feel like Derek Matravers has a thought experiment along those lines where it's,
Okay.
Imagine you take a drug that gives you like the same emotional experience that
Yeah.
you would listening to like a Beethoven symphony.
Yeah.
Right. Like how do we distinguish the aesthetic value with respect to those things, right? If the experience internally, emotionally is identical, it seems like, you've gotten the aesthetic value of the Beethoven without having engaged with the Beethoven.
That's right. Now, experientialists, this is not an objection that I came up with. I mean, it sounds like Derek has it too, but also experientialists came up with it. Like, Levinson's concerned about it, for example. Malcolm Budd is concerned about it. But they think it's easy. They think that you can answer it easily. What you need to say is that the experience that matters when it comes to explaining the value of the object is an experience that only that object could give. So if you take a drug, you might get the same. I like Derek's example. You might get the same emotional contour, but it wouldn't be the same experience because it wouldn't be experience of Beethoven. And it's being of Beethoven is part of what makes it the experience that it is. And I don't know how things get a little complicated from here, but my worry is, sure, you have the same experience now, but there's a third item we're worried about, which is the value of the experience. And now, why couldn't a drug give you the same value, just not that experience? It wouldn't be an experience of Beethoven, but it would be an experience with the same value. And then I also worry if the experientialist insists that only an experience of the Beethoven could be an experience with that value. Now it seems to me that it's the Beethoven that has the value and not the experience.
Yeah.
So I don't. So the experientialist attempt to answer the separability objection, I find it unconvincing.
A similar line of attack, may be that the experientialists might not be able to account for how a wide range of people can have a similar sort of experience, or maybe not that, but value one and the same object in very similar ways, right? Like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is valued not universally, but generally very highly by people who care about that sort of music, and the experientialist can't then say there's some quality or property of that object, right? Or, maybe it's like a causal story they can give, right? Where that object causes certain things to happen that allows for a similarity of experience, which allows for a similarity of aesthetic value, right? But there's a question of how the experientialist view doesn't just like terminate, ultimately end up with not solipsism, but like radical subjectivism or something of that sort.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, I think one thing that the experientialists would say, and this actually leads to the next point, the next objection that I have, is that we're going, and hedonists do this too. So this is not an invention of broad experientialism. So we won't say that the aesthetic value of an object is the value of just any experience it gives. We're going to say it's the value of the experience it gives when you've grasped the object properly. So this is the proper apprehension clause. So only when you've grasped the object as it is, and you have that experience of it, that's the experience that grounds its value. And that's supposedly will get rid of some of the subjectivism.
Yeah. Then it becomes a question of
supposed to do that.
Yeah, right. Then it becomes a question of what's the proper apprehension of the object. And
That's right. That's right. And then you might, probably the best account we have of this is Hume. You go to the standard case and start going through, and then you could argue, but then you could start arguing. And I think that people like Levinson have done this and about like, are these the right ones? Should we supplement it? Should we take one out? You could have those kinds of discussions about what it is to properly apprehend. But for the most part, I think that Beardsley, to my knowledge, is the first person who introduces this proper apprehension clause. In the essay in which he does it, he doesn't say too much about. He says completely incorrectly perceive. He doesn't say too much about what that comes to. And I think for the most part, it is a promissory note. So it's like, we haven't explained yet. We have not yet explained what it is to properly apprehend the thing. And that's a hard problem. And we might look to Hume to help get us a start for solving it. But whatever that turns out to be, that experience, the one when you get the object right, is the one that matters for grounding its value.
Okay. Yeah. So it always seems to be like kicking the can down the road for like a further explanation, cashing out what is, grounding the value. Yes,
that's right. But I think, I've been willing just to grant them, like, okay, spell this out however you want. But now there's a new problem, and this problem is it's I can make it most easily with hedonism, but it's going to apply to experientialism generally. So if the value of an object, aesthetic value of an object is some pleasure it gives, and now we want to say, well, which pleasure is that? It's the pleasure it gives when you properly apprehend the object. Now we have an explanation of value that appeals to hedonic considerations. And then we have this epistemic thing that we just threw on there. And now what's going to keep these two things from battling? So here's the worry I have. The pleasure you take when you properly apprehend whatever that turned out to be is probably not the greatest pleasure this object's capable of giving. There's probably some way of getting it wrong such that you're going to get more pleasure. Now, if the point of engaging with this thing is getting pleasure from it, who cares if you're apprehending it correctly? The right way to apprehend it is the way that gives you the most pleasure. And that might differ from person to person.
Yeah, right.
So this epistemic constraint that's been wheeled in it ends up undercutting the explanation of value, the impulse that founds hedonism in the first place. And it will do the same thing. It will do the exact same thing with experientialism. There's no reason to think that the most valuable experience you could have of the object is going to be the one you have when you experience it correctly.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And so like mishearing the song lyrics, right, gives you more pleasure. I'm thinking like the widespread phenomenon of, people using The Police's Every Breath You Take as like their first dance at their wedding, right? Even though if you appreciate it properly, the narrator's a stalker.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And it's like threatening.
Yeah. And so, yeah, you could go up to the couple at their wedding and just say, "Hey, listen, you've got this song wrong," and they might rightly say, if they're experientialists or hedonists, "Look, you missed the point. The point is to get the best experience you can, squeeze the best experience you can out of this thing. These things are designed to give good experience. So take the best experience it gives you."
Yeah,
but that is inconsistent with any version of experientialism I know. I think every experientialist does, and I think actually they should. They do. So if you don't wheel in this epistemic constraint, then it becomes possible to explain the phenomenon that you're just describing, which is where somebody overvalues an object. Only if so it has to be possible to think an object's got more aesthetic value than it actually has. But the only way you can make sense of that is for there to be an epistemic constraint on the object. If it doesn't have that, if you can't explain the possibility of overvaluing a thing, then your theory is already going to be shot. So there are strong reasons to bring in this epistemic constraint. But then once you bring it in, you undercut the impulse that makes the theory plausible in the first place.
Yeah, right. Because the epistemic constraint has to do with properly attending to the object, properly understanding the object, which means the value is you're trying to argue resides then in the object.
This is the best explanation for this, is that's where the value is.
Yeah, cool. So let's go into your view then, right? Which, is, I think, really flowing from, recognizing the limitations of the broader experientialist view and then, the narrower version of it with hedonism, right? And so you, in some sense, want to, locate aesthetic value in the objects we attend to. And so, I think we have some motivation here for that, but give us, a broad outline or less broad outline of your thinking.
So
here.
I mean, I think you're right that I could. I'll try to explain what I think is sort of right about hedonism and experientialism, and that will make it seem. But here's the danger. I think it will make it seem that my theory is a little closer to those views than it is. But anyway, so look, I think so. Here's a conditional that I think the experientialist will agree to. If something has aesthetic value, then you have reason to experience it. And actually, we can even go further than that. If it has aesthetic value, then you have reason to experience it as having the value it has. I affirm this conditional. That seems to me correct. Well, what is the reason that you have to experience it? And for the experientialist, it's the value of the experience. You should experience this thing because of the value of the experience it's going to give you. And I think that you should experience it because the kind of value it has is a value that gives you reason to experience it. And so that makes it just seem like, well, it's just a matter of locating where the value is. But I think that the differences are more radical than that. Maybe I should pause before does this seem, should I keep going?
Yeah, please keep going.
Should I explain why it's more radical?
Yes.
Well, so here's an assumption that just about everybody who's writing about aesthetic value makes. if we're what we're doing when we give a theory of aesthetic value, at least in part, is we're grounding aesthetic value. So aesthetic value is not, it's apparently some kind of derivative value. This is the assumption. It's not a basic kind of value. So we need to figure out what kind of value it is. And the hedonist comes along and says, oh, I'll tell you what kind of value it is. It's hedonic. And the experientialist says, oh, that's a little too narrow. It's actually this broader class. It's experiential value. And in some theories like T's, it's like a special kind of experiential value, sort of engagement kind of value. And then the cognitivist, a certain kind of cognitivist, I don't think all, I mean, so a certain kind of cognitivist, we might be on the same page, but a certain kind of cognitivist will say, no, it's cognitive value that grounds aesthetic value. It's what the object shows us about the world. Communitarians will say it's some value that it has in virtue of fostering good aesthetic communities. And then Dom Lopez has got a view according to which it's a species of the most basic kind of practical value. And this allows for a certain kind of achievement. And so these are all what we're trying to do in all cases is figure out what kind of value aesthetic value is. And on my view, there is no, you're asking the wrong question. If the kind of value aesthetic value is aesthetic value, there is no more basic value than aesthetic value that grounds it.
Right.
So my view is not you were wrong about the kind of value that you said aesthetic value is. It's actually this other, and that's what all of those theories I just mentioned. The competition therein is to figure out which one of us picks out the right kind of value to ground aesthetic value. But none of them, to my knowledge, ever argue that aesthetic value is the kind of value that should be grounded. The value they ground aesthetic value in, they don't ground that value. They're just like, this one doesn't need it. But aesthetic value somehow needs grounding. And that's what I think isn't true.
Yeah, right. And so, I guess how the discussion has gone generally is, okay, there's this overarching genus, value. And then under value, there's moral value, there's practical value, there's instrumental value. And then there, cognitive value, epistemic value, right? And then there's aesthetic value. And so the question is, or one way of conceiving it is, okay, aesthetic value may be one species under the genus, right? And so what are the differentia that are separating moral value from aesthetic value, et cetera, right? Another way of thinking about it is, well, actually, aesthetic value is a subspecies of, say, practical value, which, is Dom's argument, right? And how, what you're wanting to say is that way of thinking is just misguided, right? It's failing to isolate what aesthetic value truly is.
So aesthetic value, and I think this is probably true of other kinds of value, like moral value, although it's more specific than the genus value, it is nevertheless more fundamental. And I think that the versions of the Euthyphro problem, when brought to aesthetics, seem to indicate this. That's part of the argument. This is the case. But if the species aesthetic value is more fundamental than its genus, and I think this is, and then if species of aesthetic value, like beauty, are more fundamental than aesthetic value, and so on, then the thing that's going to do the grounding is going to be the determinate way the object is. And that's what we see when you have a determinable relationship, which is what I think we have in the case of aesthetic value and value, and also beauty and aesthetic value and so on.
So what's, just for people who might not be familiar with that, what's like a straightforward example of the determinable?
So, a straightforward examples would be a color example. So red is a determinant of the determinable color, which is to say red's just a determinate way that color is. And things are not red because they're colored, but they're colored because they're red. So red is the more foundational term. And then the same thing is going to be true if you take a species of redness. So scarlet take something that's scarlet, it's red because it's scarlet. The more specific thing is more fundamental as opposed to the other way around. It's not scarlet because it's red. And the same thing will be true until you get down to absolutely determinate shades. And the claim of my paper is that aesthetic value appears to be behaving in the same way. And you can see this when we explain the aesthetic value of something. When we ask what makes this thing aesthetically valuable, we might go to a more specific kind of aesthetic value. We might say, well, in this case, it's its beauty, or in this case, it's its sublimity. And then we're going to be asked, well, what is it? What makes it sublime? And then we're going to go to something more specific still. And I don't think that explanations of aesthetic value go from that they explain the general in terms of the specific. I don't think anyone can test this. And it seems to me that it suggests that it's the utterly specific that is fundamental in the domain of aesthetic value. But if that's true, then aesthetic value cannot be grounded by finding some value, some more general value that's more fundamental than it, in the way that all the theories that we've been talking about attempt to ground it.
Okay, so aesthetic value inheres, I think, ultimately on your view, right, in the specific way particular things are, yes, rather than this general thing. And so, like, yes, the experientialists sort of makes the mistake in grounding aesthetic value in the experience, right? You know, because it's a particular sort of experience in their view, right? And then if you add that epistemic constraint, what that's pointing to is your view, right? Which is aesthetic value resides not in this particular sort of experience this thing generates, but rather in the particular sort of way the thing is, which gives an account of our experience of it.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Good. Thanks.
No. Awesome. And so, you know, how then do you account for disagreement about aesthetic objects, right? Where, you know, if, you know, in some sense, aesthetic value resides in like the objective features of an object, the particular way it actually is, right? What happens when you and I disagree, right? It's, you know, we maybe, you know, and there are lots of ways disagreement can go, right? You think it's beautiful, I think it's ugly, you know, we both agree that it's beautiful, but we have disagreement about the particularities of the beauty, or we both agree, you know, that, you know, the curry is spicy, for example, but whereas I find it delightfully spicy, you find it like painfully and unenjoyably spicy, right? Like, how do you then cash out disagreement, or account for, rather, disagreement?
Yeah, great question. Like the first thing I would say is that this is going to seem inadequate, but hang on. Like lots of cases of reported aesthetic disagreement turn out not to be disagreement at all. I mean, so clearly, this is not the example that you just gave. Actually, the example you gave was not this one. But you know, my liking it and your disliking it, those are consistent with each other.
Yeah.
And just in general, I mean, you're having, I guess maybe this is saying the same thing. I mean, you're preferring something to something else, and my having the opposite preference, that's not any kind of disagreement. These things sometimes get posed as problems for a view according to which aesthetic value is objective. But that's just a preliminary thing to say. I mean, I actually think that like true, like honest to goodness cases of disagreement support objectivity as opposed to the way around. Here's how I'm thinking about this. I should probably back off and say, I think it's possible not to be an objectivist and still hold my view. I mean, you could be some kind of error theorist. So that's a possibility that I mean, I don't know if it's very attractive, but that's a possibility. But getting back to the point about disagreement, so you have a genuine disagreement, as I understand what disagreement is. You and I are genuinely disagreeing only if at least one of us is wrong. It could be we're both wrong, right? But it might be that, or it might be that one of us is right and one of us is wrong. But if it's a disagreement, what's not happening is that we're both right. But if one of us is wrong, then there's something that makes one of us wrong. and that's the way the object is. So I can't make any sense of disagreement unless I think that there's something about which we're disagreeing, and that something about which we're disagreeing is the object in the way that it is. So it seems to me that the disagreement, like if I were, well, we'll just call this position subjectivism, whatever it means. If I were some kind of subjectivist, I feel like I should deny that people ever, disagreement never happens. What I shouldn't do is come up with a bunch of examples of disagreement and say, look, isn't subjectivism true? I mean, those are all genuine instances of disagreement, are all premises that support objectivism, I think.
Yeah, that seems right. Because if you're a subjectivist, then any way of valuing it is equally good to any other.
Yeah.
Meaning I say it's good, you say it's bad. We are just talking past each other.
We're not disagreeing.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think you need to say cases where it seems like we are really disagreeing. So you say it's boring and not exciting, and I say it's exciting, not boring, and it seems like we really are disagreeing. If we're subjectivists, we need to explain that away and say what appears to be happening right now is not happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I extend this, but sort of other premises in subjectivist arguments, like that we see things from a perspective. So you have a perspective on the object, and I have a different perspective on the object, and this should support subjectivism. But if we take seriously what I just have a perspective on an object, it means you have the object from an angle. It means you get part of the object. It means there's part of the object you don't get. And the thought that there's more to the object than I'm getting is subjectivism.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I don't even know if I am an objectivist, actually, because as I said, I don't know if my view implies it, but I don't find the arguments against it compelling.
Yeah, right. Or at the very least, in your view, the particular way an object is generates reasons for perceiving it, or ways, generates reasons for, experience it, engaging with it. And so can you talk about just that piece a little bit, right? The reason generating nature of the particular way things are. Right. And I guess further, thinking of, you said earlier on that you think that your view is in line with Kant in some way, right? Is that one way there's a similarity, right? That they're reason generating for anyone to experience that thing.
I do think, I guess I am inclined to believe in a kind of universalism. And so I do think that a difference for Kant between an agreeable object and a beautiful object. I should get this in Kant. Kant is, in some sense, a subjectivist. But when he says, when we say the object is beautiful, when we say that the object's agreeable, I'm just talking about myself. I can't be wrong about that because its value is mental. So unless I'm mistaken about what's going on inside in me, in my own experience, then I can't be wrong about whether something's, but I can be wrong, according to Kant, about whether something's beautiful or not. And when we say the thing is beautiful, we treat it as if beauty were an objective property of the object. So there's more to the object than I'm getting of it. I can be wrong about it. And so I take Kant. I may be wrong about this. I take Kant, if you do kind of youthful problems with Kant, is the agreeable because it pleases? The answer is yeah. Is the beautiful because it pleases? No. It pleases because it's beautiful. And that's why I take Kant to be. Now, I don't know if Kant is in all of the history of philosophy is the figure that's probably. I'm not much of a Kantian. I'm not enough of a Kantian. To be Kantian is a full-time job. It's not the job. So I'm sure lots of Kantians will say, nah, or even just what I said was wrong. I don't know. But But that's why when I read Kant, I find myself reading somebody who I think is thinking along similar lines. I've actually argued in print that Hume is on this side too. That if you do Youthful Problem with Hume, Hume doesn't think that things Hume and Kant think that beautiful things please, and we with our hedonistic assumptions read them, and we assume that they're just hedonists. But I think they both think that things please because they're beautiful and not the other way around.
Yeah, I think that's certainly right for Kant. I'm less familiar with the Hume on this point, but I mean, for Kant, I think it's precisely there's a determinate way the thing is. That way the thing is sets our mental faculties in this certain sort of relationship with one another. And that generates, the experience of the beautiful, which is recognizing a quality of that object as it exists independently of us.
Yeah. But I don't think I got historically sidetracked. I think your question had to do with the reason giving, how reason is working. So, I guess I think this is a widespread assumption that values are necessarily reason giving. I don't think values are reason givingness. The value is the thing, is whatever it is about the object that makes it such that it gives the reason. So we can individuate objects according to what kinds of reasons they give us to do things. And I claim in the paper that an aesthetic reason, I think we should take seriously the etymology of aesthetic. An aesthetic reason is in some very difficult sense to define perceptual. So aesthetically valued objects give us reason to perceive them. They don't give us reason to perceive them in just any way. They give us reason to perceive them as having the value that they have. And so there's a kind of reflexivity in this, because it's being valuable. It gives you reason to experience it as having that value, which gives you reason to experience it. It's not circular, but it is reflexive. Is there a good question about what perceive means in this context? Because it can make it sound like lots of things that have aesthetic values, such as works of literature.
Yeah.
We don't perceive works of literature, so they can't have aesthetic value on this account. And I am working with a much broader notion of perception.
Okay.
I think unhelpfully, I don't cite my own work on this in my paper, but I've written a few. But I am still thinking about this. I think that minimally, when you perceive an object as beautiful, that judgment, here I follow Kant, that judgment is a perceptual judgment. It's a non-inferential judgment. So all aesthetically valuable objects have I'll just listen to beauty. Every beautiful object has at least one perceptual property, the property of being beautiful. And it can have that perceptual property in virtue of having all sorts of non-perceptual properties. That's a kind of a more minimal claim. I think there's a stronger claim that I haven't defended, but that I'm interested in defending, and that is that every object that's capable of having aesthetic value sits in consciousness. This is going to sound fancy. Sits in consciousness the same way that straightforwardly perceptual objects do. So there's a class of objects that are perceptual in the broad sense. Objects that are perceptual in the narrow sense are a species of this class. They have certain features in common that we're familiar with. We recognize that objects that are perceptual in the narrow sense have these features, but it turns out that there's this broader class of object. And anyway, the narrow claim is that anything that has aesthetic value has at least one property, the property of being aesthetically valuable. That's a perceptual property in a broad sense. The stronger claim, the one I haven't made yet, is that it can have that kind of perceptual property because the object itself is, in a broader sense, it sits in consciousness the same way that narrowly perceptual objects do.
Yeah. right? And so, yeah, as you said, a work of literature, right? Like the story lacks perceptual properties. Now, obviously, like the words on the page do, or if it's, a story that's being told like an audiobook, right? It has auditory features, but like the events that are happening in the narrative are non-perceptual. And yet what you're wanting to argue is, well, if it is a beautiful story, right, then it has at least that perceptual property of being beautiful in that particular way, right? And that is accessed by means of the text's, right, non-perceptual properties.
That's right. That's right. And I embrace claims made by physicists and mathematicians that theories and equations are beautiful. So I don't think I have access to that beauty because I don't have the mathematical chops to be able to get these objects before my mind in such a way that I can perceive their beauty. But I don't think this is metaphorical. I think this is, I believe them. I believe them. I think if a theory can account for what they're telling us about these objects, it ought to.
Yeah, and with respect to that expert knowledge, I think maybe we'll end with this question is, as I was reading, the new paper, right? Because you're wanting to ground aesthetic value in the particular way that particular objects are, right? On your view, there's a really important role that art criticism plays, right? Because an art critic, whether a professional expert or else, an aficionado who lacks, academic training, right? Like what their job is in part is, in a sense, helping us attend to the particular aspects of the particular object that we may have otherwise missed. And this relates to your point of, the perspectivalism of the subjectivist view, right? That, each of us is coming at a particular aesthetic object from a particular angle, from a particular perspective, and that perspective is limited, which means, and you don't necessarily go into this in the paper, but I think it's like helping to flesh out like the more communitarian picture, right? That there's a value in, or even like Dom's network theory, right? There's a value of engaging with other people because they can help enhance the limitations of our perspectives, which can make available to us aspects of the aesthetic value that may not have been previously available to us, but also make us aware of the particular reasons to engage with objects we may not otherwise engage with. That was a long-winded response, but I think, I'm, heaping praise on your view. I think.
Oh yeah. Well, good. I mean, so it's a consequence of this, right. So that the critic has an important role, it just falls right out of the view. I mean, I'm also, but I guess, it falls out in this way. When you think that there's a philosophical job for aestheticians to do, which is find the kind of thing, it's up to, we think we have to explain what makes aesthetically valuable objects aesthetically valuable. And so we say, well, it's some general thing, like pleasure or like experience or like the kind of communities it fosters or this practical value. My claim is there's no such thing. There is no such thing. And that means there is no job here for philosophers to be doing. And when you think there's a job here for philosophers to doing, you are taking on the work that probably belongs to the critic. All there is to do is to explain with respect to each particular object that has aesthetic value, what makes that one have the aesthetic value that it has. And I agree that this is a project that requires a community. And I also do agree, although I have not explained this in the paper anywhere, but I mean, aesthetic value is sort of deeply and importantly public. It belongs to, we don't all have access to it, but it belongs to all of us. So that's, I mean, I think this is Kant's right about this. And so, yeah, it's a project we take on together, and our critics have a special role with respect to the class of aesthetically valuable objects that they're experts in.
Yeah. Awesome. So I think we'll end the discussion there. So James, thank you so much for joining me. This was an absolutely terrific discussion.
I enjoyed it. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Awesome.